Welcome to Secret Art of Spacetime, a podcast about ideas, culture, and spirituality. My name is Andy. I hope you enjoy this show. Hello. Today I want to explore the simulation theory, which I'm sure you know about. It's been going around. And even within spiritual communities, there seems to be a real interest in this idea. I do think there's a certain intuitive appeal to it, but I want to really dig into this theory in a deeper way. Like, what actually is the theory? And how can we make sense of it in the context of some of the things that we've been talking about on the podcast? So in the context of the hard problem of consciousness, in the context of spirituality and energetics, and what can that context offer to our understanding of this theory and whether it is viable. And so, spoiler, I think there are good reasons why there's an intuitive appeal to the theory, but I think that it's actually fundamentally anti-spiritual for reasons I'm going to explain. And I think the reason is because I think it's rooted in the reductive materialist paradigm, which we've talked about on this show is really no longer viable as a paradigm. So first of all, what is the actual theory? What is the argument? So the simulation theory as like a formal argument was proposed by Nick Bostrom in 2003. And I suppose actually technically it's a hypothesis rather than a theory. So let me just make that correction. So the way the formal argument goes is that if consciousness is not dependent on a particular substrate, meaning if consciousness is not dependent on a brain necessarily, and given that our computational power is increasing so rapidly, and presuming that any sufficiently advanced society will run simulations, and particularly what Bostrom calls ancestor simulations, so simulations of their own society at an earlier stage of development, then the odds are that we are living in such a simulation. So he says in the conclusion, quote, "A technologically mature post-human civilization would have enormous computing power. Based on this empirical fact, the simulation argument shows that at least one of the following propositions is true. 1. The fraction of human-level civilizations that reach a post-human stage is very close to 0. Or 2, the fraction of post-human civilizations that are interested in running ancestor simulations is very close to 0. Or 3, the fraction of all people with our kind of experiences that are living in a simulation is very close to 1, unquote. Meaning, according to this argument, as long as humans continue to develop and reach what he calls a post-human stage, where computation power is much higher than it is even now. So as long as that's the case, and as long as such humans are actually interested in running these kinds of simulations that he is talking about, namely simulations that look a lot like or exactly like the lives we live, then it's very likely that we are in such a simulation. The argument makes sense, right? like we seem to like running simulations, right? There are all kinds of computer games that could be understood as simulations of life. It seems very likely that computational power will keep increasing and that future humans will continue to run simulations. And so he does some probability calculations where he estimates, because such post-human civilizations have such immense computing power, it's likely they run a lot of these simulations, and therefore the probability works out that it's likely we are in such a simulation. It's less likely that we are among the very rare real humans who eventually develop the simulations, as long as those future humans create a lot of simulations, I think is basically the probability aspect of the argument. I mean, I think the probability aspect sounds reasonable to me, but, and you might be able to anticipate this given what we've been talking about, the real issue with this argument, in my humble opinion, is that it depends on the assumption that a physical system creates consciousness, right? So we talked about this a lot in the episode called, what was it called? Paradigm Crux, where I talked about the hard problem of consciousness and how, while there's clearly a correlation between conscious states and the brain, there's still no theory. There's no causal mechanism. So there's no scientific theory that shows that the brain is causing consciousness. And a lot of scientists, or at least people who speak and write about science, have a lot of hope, I suppose, is one way to word it, that there will be such a theory that will be discovered, that, one day we'll figure it out. But it is a hope. It's not a theory. It's not science. It's a belief it's a hope. It's a matter of faith. It's an aspect of the materialistic paradigm that assumes there must be some causal connection there. But let's be really clear that it's not a theory, it's not a finding, it's a hope or a belief. And this entire argument rests on that hope or belief. And he doesn't really talk about it. He does talk about substrate independence. But as we spoke about in that earlier episode, there are some conceptual issues with this idea, not just that it's an assumption, but that it doesn't really make conceptual sense to understand consciousness, which is a felt experience, a subjective experience, what it's like to anything, right? To be a human, to have any kind of experience, what it's like, that's fundamentally different than material objects like the brain. This assumption that matter creates or causes consciousness is on very shaky ground, which I really made that case in Paradigm Crux, that earlier episode. Okay, I hope I'm being clear here. This is maybe a little bit tricky because Bostrom talks about substrate independence, meaning that the mind or consciousness may not be dependent on the specific substrate, namely a brain, but could be related to another physical system like a computer. But what he doesn't mention is that even if substrate independence holds, that still doesn't show that either a brain or a computer causes or creates consciousness. So let me just back up here for a second, just to make sure that we're on the same page here. So for this hypothesis to make sense, we have to understand that a simulated human, so like a character in a computer game, is conscious because we are conscious, right? So if we are in a simulation, then it must be possible for characters in a simulation to be conscious. I guess this line of reasoning goes that if games become more and more and more complex, the characters become more and more complex to the point where they would somehow develop consciousness. But you see how there's this assumption that is not spelled out, and it's a big assumption, right? That somehow these characters at some point develop consciousness. Now, I suppose if we're going to be generous to this way of thinking, we might imagine that the simulation isn't causing consciousness, but that it somehow houses consciousness. What might make sense, to me anyway, is to imagine that it's the one playing the game who is conscious, and that their consciousness is somehow transferred to the character. So it's like if you're playing a computer game that is so complex and so like reality that we lose ourselves in it and fully become the character. I think from that perspective, that makes a little bit more sense to me as how we might understand a simulated character as having consciousness. So this would imply that we are each playing a game. We forgot that we were playing a game. We've gotten lost in the game. That feels more believable to me, and it resolves this issue of this big unspoken assumption, because it explains how a simulated character could be conscious without requiring that the simulation itself is creating the consciousness. But now we might wonder, who are we if we're playing this game? And who created the game? And now, is this just a different way to talk about spirituality? Because isn't the one who created the game kind of like God? And aren't we now basically souls existing in some other realm who have incarnated here into this quote-unquote simulation for a certain period of time? And if God created the game, then what was the original? Like, for this to be a simulation, presumably there had to be some original, real version of this reality, which in this line of thinking now, if I start to imagine it as like we are players in this game, that's where this line of thought starts to lose me, is, well, what was the original? Like, if we're players in this game, were we ever not players? Like, wouldn't it make more sense to see it as like, okay, we could imagine physical reality as sort of game-like, as this construct created by this powerful creator being that we might as well call God, right? But then what was the original? Like, in this way of thinking, it doesn't make sense to me anymore to think of it now as a simulation. Maybe beings within this world become more powerful, like post-human, to use Bostrom's language, and themselves develop new worlds. Like, maybe we are players in a game, and maybe eventually the players in the game can themselves develop new games, new worlds. And maybe it goes on to infinity. There's always the potential to develop a new world. But in this way of thinking, what was the original? Why are we thinking of it as a simulation? Maybe it's actually a creation. Maybe it's a whole new thing. Maybe it's a whole new world. Maybe it's a whole new universe. Maybe there was no original. So even as I am trying to be more generous to this way of thinking, I still run into problems with it. It still just does not make sense to me. Now, given that Bostrom's idea, the simulation theory, is so popular and has a certain intuitive appeal, despite that it's based on a very big assumption, which is often not even mentioned, why is it so popular? What is the appeal? I think there are at least 3 reasons. The first reason is that reductive materialism is still the dominant paradigm. And any paradigm requires certain assumptions. And when you're living in that paradigm, those assumptions will seem just obvious, taken for granted. So that's one reason the theory, I think, is so popular and seems almost obviously true to a lot of people, because it is, in a way, the logical conclusion of reductive materialism. If the tenets of reductive materialism are true, right, if everything, including consciousness, can be reduced to matter, then the argument holds a lot of weight, right? So that's one reason I think this theory is so prominent. Now, there's another, maybe more interesting reason that this way of thinking has a certain intuitive appeal. And I think that's because it's very similar to other arguments or ideas that have been put forward many times that are spiritual. So, for example, maybe most famously, Plato's cave allegory, where Plato describes most humans as like we're in a cave, staring at the cave wall, watching like shadow puppets, right? The shadows cast by a fire, and taking those shadows to be reality, not understanding that those shadows are shadows of reality. And so Plato says that most humans are like that. We're mistaking the shadows for reality. So the reality we experience is not the real reality. It's an illusion. So the simulation theory is similar to that, right? It says that this world we experience is not real. It's a simulation. But Plato's allegory doesn't require that this assumption that consciousness can be created by computers. And importantly, Plato's whole philosophy and, much of philosophy can be understood as how we become aware of the true reality behind the shadows. Whereas the simulation theory suggests that there is no way out. We are trapped in this simulation. We aren't actually really real. So that's a really fundamentally important difference between the simulation theory and Plato's allegory, right? Plato is encouraging us to be philosophers, right? Who question things and find their way more closely to the truth. It's also somewhat similar to Gnostic ideas where material reality is understood as being created by the Demiurge, and it's fundamentally illusory. So the work of Gnosticism, which is gnosis, right? Experiential knowledge, experiential knowing, enlightenment, right? Is to see and know beyond the material world. In this context, we could understand ideas like the simulation theory, like this idea of uploading consciousness onto computers, like technologies like Neuralink that propose to hook us up into the web, we could see those as the concretization or the sort of final move of the demiurge, which seeks to trap us in the material world. The simulation theory is also resonant with other spiritual ideas. For example, the Hindu concept of Maya, right, which can be translated as illusion. The world we experience is an illusion. It's like a dream. It's not the real reality. And yet, of course, in the context of Hinduism, spirituality is meant as a means to bring us closer to the truth. And I think a case could be made that in both of these frameworks, Plato and this idea of Maya, the real, what is true, is the conscious observing subject. Precisely the thing that's being explained away or assumed away in Nick Bostrom's theory, right? So in ancient Greek philosophy, the idea of know thyself, where self could be understood as the observer, the witness. And in certain schools of Hinduism, Buddhism, yoga, the Purusha, the self, the conscious subject, the awareness, the observer, the witness, right, is seen as who we really are, right? So in some of these systems, the one I'm most familiar with is yoga. The whole purpose of the spiritual work is to stop over-identifying with the mind and the body, with the stuff of our consciousness, and to identify with the witness, with the observer, with consciousness itself. And that can be seen as the goal of the spiritual work, of the spiritual journey, to re-identify with who we really are, with consciousness itself. And notice that this possibility for spiritual development is nullified in this simulation theory framework. In fact, it's almost the inverse, where we're told to more fully identify with the material world, with the body, with the mind, and to disidentify with consciousness itself, or to see consciousness as merely emergent from those physical properties, when in a spiritual perspective, it's usually seen as precisely the reverse. Consciousness is fundamental. Now, when I talk about disidentifying with the mind and body, I don't mean to not care about the mind and body. My personal philosophy is that even as we understand who we really are as not merely material, I think we're here in material form, in bodies on earth, for a reason, not to escape this realm, but to bring love to it, really, to put it simply. I don't think as souls we would come here merely to escape. I think that we are here to cultivate beauty and care and love and creativity and to learn and to evolve as souls. So personally, I don't think materiality is evil or bad or inherently corrupt. So, all to say, when I speak about re-identifying with the conscious subject and disidentifying with mind and body, I am not saying that we should hate or dislike materiality, but that our relation to it is important. And, what kind of relationship do we want to have with material reality? That seems like maybe an important question. So I think this is maybe the biggest reason that there's such an intuitive pull to the simulation theory, because it's very similar to something that might be deeply, deeply true, but it's a distortion of it. So I go really deep into this idea of distortion in an episode I created for paying subscribers called The Distortion Dynamic. So if you want to go really deep into this idea, you can get that recording as a subscriber. But the main idea is that in part because of this materialist paradigm, we tend to think that a thing either is true or false. Whereas if we operate in a non-materialist paradigm, an energetics paradigm, which is, I think, one way to describe this new paradigm that is crystallizing in science and beyond science. In an energetic paradigm, we understand things as frequencies, as waveforms, and in this context, the idea of distortion becomes really relevant. So any signal can be like a true, clear signal, or it can be distorted. A distortion isn't the opposite of the truth. In fact, it's very similar to the truth, but it's importantly distorted. And it can lead to a lot of confusion when we're not understanding things in terms of energetics, when we're still operating in a materialist frame where a thing either is or is not, then a distortion can often appear as the truth because it's so similar to the truth, even though often it's very importantly different. So I like to think of the simulation theory as a distortion of a really important deep truth, which is that our experiential reality is somehow dreamlike, that it's real as an illusion, but there's something illusory to it, but it's the spiritual path that brings us closer to the truth, that helps us to re-identify with who we really are, which is consciousness itself, right? Which is unnameable. It's not something we can talk about or define or theorize, because it's that which observes all the things, all the matter. It's the one doing the theorizing. Now, I think where this leaves us is this question of if reality is not simply reality, if there's an illusory aspect to it, and there's a lot of reasons to think there is, right? Not just for all the reasons we spoke about, but just the sort of basic reflection on perception, right? If there's a way in which reality is dreamlike or illusory, what then? What should our relationship to this illusory reality be? And that's something that I want to pick up in future episodes. The third reason that I think the simulation hypothesis is so appealing to so many people is political. Although the more I think about it, the more this third reason is ballooning into not just political, but also social and cultural. We're going to talk about this in the second part to this episode, which I'm going to share soon, probably next week. So until then, thank you so much, everyone. Take care. To support the show and this work that I'm doing, you can become a paying subscriber on Substack. I've been sharing recordings with paying subscribers that go deeper into some of these energetic concepts that I've been speaking about. So there's a recording up on the distortion dynamic that I mentioned in this episode. There's also a recording about the energies of this year, 2025, and how we can best work with them. In that recording, I also discuss the difference between fate and destiny, which can be helpful as we work to find greater alignment with our own destiny. And if you're not ready to become a paying subscriber, you can become a free subscriber and receive my newsletter, which includes when I release new episodes, as well as writing and other messages from me. There's a whole archive of blog posts on my Substack. The link is in the show notes. Thank you so much, everyone. Until next time, goodbye.